Welcome to Chapter 4. In our last chapter, we looked at how the English colonies evolved and how the culture that they brought with them slowly became the dominant American culture of the United States and the standard for groups that sought to merge. We examined the ethnocentric mentality of the Americans and their assumption that other groups would give up their cultures and embrace theirs. We also looked closely at how the blacks and the Native Americans resisted merging and remained on the periphery. This chapter looks closely at the movement of people since 1815 and the factors that contributed to that movement. Advances in agriculture brought many changes to the traditional farming methods that required a greater labor force. With fewer laborers needed, workers were forced to move into cities where industry was advancing or to other countries. The healthy supply of food made possible by the advances in agriculture brought on rapid population increases in many areas. The advent of industrialism spurred the movement of vast numbers of people out of their own lands to other countries. In America, immigrants arrived in large numbers when times were good, and the flow slowed down when economic times were hard. The U.S. experienced three great streams of immigration. The first of these immigration periods was from 1820 to 1889. During this period, people from Western and Northern Europe seemed to be most on the move. They came in large numbers during the 1850s and even larger numbers during the 1880s. The second great period of immigration from 1890 to 1924 saw mostly people from Southern and Eastern Europe arrive in the U.S., while the third great period of immigration from 1946 to the present saw mostly people from Latin America and Asia coming in. During the 1820s, the American economy had taken a bad turn, making it an unpopular destination for immigrants. But that would change drastically over the next 10 years as new arrivals sent word back home of the opportunities America offered. Over 4 million people made the move to America during the 1830s and the 1840s. The 1830s and 40s saw a great influx of Irish who began arriving before the Germans and in larger numbers. The Germans would eventually outpace Irish immigration in the 1850s. A high population, policies surrounding land tenure, and an over-reliance on the potato were key factors in the potato famine that brought so many Irish to America. When the crop was destroyed by a pernicious rot during the 1840s, the resulting famine created a mass exodus of people from Ireland to England and the United States. Unfortunately, the reception of the United States was less than warm. The Irish concentrated themselves into little Dublins and shanty towns where conditions were poor. They didn't behave themselves too well and were looked down upon by the Anglo-Americans. They eventually did well as they managed to dominate the Catholic Church in America and use their experience with their former overlords to gain political influence, to the point that Anglo-Americans began efforts to regulate their immigration. They reacted to the hostility by hunkering down in their own communities and supporting each other. Irish women also arrived on our shores in large numbers. Single Irish women saw little hope in Ireland, with many of the men leaving and employment opportunities even scarcer. They eventually began to arrive in larger numbers than the men. They found their niche in domestic service and were more likely to be hired over other groups because they were single and they spoke English. As we said before, the Germans began arriving shortly after the Irish, at first in smaller numbers and in greater numbers by the 1850s. Like the Irish, the Germans were pushed out of their lands by crop failures and financial hardship. At the close of the 1800s, they comprised the largest ethnic group in the U.S. They were unfamiliar with the language and the American culture and made efforts to preserve their ways. They set up their own schools and churches and found ways to maintain their communities and found ways to support each other via various organizations and societies. Their language became so prominent in many areas that schools offered bilingual instruction. Among those immigrating to the U.S. were a group called the 48ers. These were Germans of high standing whose politics and tendency towards radical reform brought them to America in search of a democratic utopia. Although they were a bit disappointed when they arrived, they remained politically active and established centers of radical reform and sponsored newspapers to spread their propaganda. The 1870s saw a different kind of immigrant begin to arrive as newcomers from Norway and Sweden began to land on our shores, with their numbers continually increasing through 1880. The U.S. Congress was given power to regulate immigration, and as receiving facilities in New York began to overcrowd, a new facility was opened on Ellis Island. It became known as the Isle of Tears because many who arrived were turned away. Our authors next walk us through the second great immigrant stream, which began in 1890 and lasted until 1924. This movement saw large numbers of people from Southern and Eastern Europe arrive in America. They were more unlike the English than the first stream of immigrants in their language and their customs. Their reasons for coming were different as well, since they were brought in by labor recruiters and didn't come seeking religious and political freedom. Otherwise, they too were poor and had been forced off of their land by industrialization. With the frontier no longer an option after 1890, the new arrivals were relegated to the factories and railroads for employment. By 1900, they dominated nearly all segments of industrial production. Disease devastated their ethnic slums and threw a dark pall over their experience in America. The Italians arriving at that time fared no better. They too arrived in large numbers, beginning in 1890 from southern Italy. Even though their background was in agriculture, many chose to go into blue and white collar jobs when they arrived. Many of the men were referred to as sojourners, since they had no intention of remaining here. Few women immigrated with them, and most were forced to live in unfit conditions. The Italians soon came to be associated with organized crime, even though they were underrepresented in the prisons. Little Italies were thought to be rife with crime. The Italians brought with them the differences they had in their mother country, with the Southerners and Northerners considering themselves both culturally and economically different. The differences could be seen from street to street and block to block in their neighborhoods. The rejection and hostility of the Anglo-Americans towards the Italians led to groups joining to support one another. Our authors refer to this as ethnogenesis. This phenomenon can occur either because the two groups share various characteristics or because they share the rejection of the dominant group. The next group we focus on is the Jews. Our authors start with the Sephardim, who were the first to arrive from Spain, Portugal, and Holland. The Ashkenazim were of German origin and came from Central and Eastern Europe. The latter arrived in greater numbers and came to dominate Jewish American life. The German Jews were all about reform. Their reform movement called for less Hebrew in their services, and they observed Sabbath on Sundays. They were also a bit more liberal on the issue of intermarriage. Their work as peddlers led to the establishment of some of our great department stores. The German Jews became the elite Jewish group in America. The second immigrant stream saw 2 million German and Russian Jews arrive in America. The Russian Jews, unlike the German, desired to keep their culture pure in the New World. The Russian Jews were much like the Italians in that they had no desire to merge with the American culture. They did, however, bring their families with a view to making a life in America. Their working and living conditions were poor. They were forced to labor for low wages and live in crowded, unsanitary conditions. The Jews eagerly took advantage of educational opportunities and advanced in politics at a much faster rate than the Italians. They had skills that made them more desirable in the labor market. Both Russian and German Jews were successful in business and real estate. The garment industry was one area where the Jews found great success and profit. The wages, the hours, and the conditions, however, were far less than desirable. Those who sought to unionize and improve their conditions found considerable resistance. The Jews took refuge in their neighborhoods to hide from the discrimination of the dominant group. Not only did they survive the onslaught of discrimination in their neighborhoods, they also managed to thrive economically and become a prosperous group. 1924 saw the end of the second great immigrant stream and the advent of the national origins principle, or quotas, for immigration. This policy was favored by newcomers whose origins were the same as those of the first and second immigrant streams, and was based on the idea that some groups are superior to others. As industrialization became more globalized, the golden door was shut for many who sought to come to America. Numerous laws were enacted, and a grip of agencies were formed to deal with the numerous issues surrounding immigration. Our authors next introduce us to the third great immigration stream, which began in 1946 and continues today. This movement is dominated by Latin Americans. The ravages of World War II left many people in dire straits. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 and its subsequent amendments in 1965 softened the previous immigration policies that were put in place at the end of the second great stream of immigration. 1943 saw a wave of temporary workers arrive from Mexico. This and the passage of the Displaced Persons Act in 1948 made it clear that previous policies were in need of change. Further proof of the softer attitude towards immigration was a sharp criticism that the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 received because of its adherence to quotas based on national origins. These policies were abolished in 1965 by the Hart-Celler Act, which did away with racial and gender discrimination, increased the number of relatives, citizens, and permanent residents could bring, and favored immigrants with skills needed in the U.S. The act also provided asylum for refugees. Our authors end the chapter with a quick overview of the socio-cultural impact that the many changes in immigration policies had on American society. They first tell us that the changes were a response to the global changes that occurred after World War II and the surge of displaced persons and refugees. They also state that a second effect was the domination of Latin Americans in the third great immigration stream, and the borrowing of America, as some came to call it. Finally, the new challenge of immigrating legally to America brought an increase of undocumented workers.